Church, today we begin a new series, but not a new story. It's a continuation of the same powerful movement we just spent the last couple of weeks exploring. You remember it, our series titled Rescue. We trace the thread of God's mighty plan to redeem humanity from the brokenness of sin. We saw the arc of redemption stretch from Genesis to the Gospels. And in that final message, we stood in awe before an empty tomb. Jesus risen, death defeated, hope restored. But friends, that wasn't the end of the story. It was the climax, the high point, the moment where rescue became reality. Yet God didn't roll the credits there. The resurrection was not the epilogue. It was the launch pad. Because what Jesus began, God continues through his people even today. The rescue didn't stop. It spreads. It moves forward through daring faith, bold obedience, and courageous steps. And that brings us to this new series, Daring. Women who carried the rescue forward. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to meet 3 women who didn't just live in the rescue story, they carried it forward. Women who stood in the gap. Women who made a way. Women who believed when belief wasn't easy. Who led when leadership was questioned. Who said yes when everything in them could have said no. We'll look at Deborah, who dared to lead when no one else would. We'll look at Esther, who dared to speak up when silence was safer. We'll look at Mary, who dared to say yes when God's plan interrupted her own. These women remind us of something powerful, that God has always used the faith of the faithful to move his rescue plan forward. And he's still doing it today. That means you and me. You may not have a crown like Esther, or a palm tree courtyard like Deborah, or an angelic announcement like Mary, but you have something just as important. You have influence. You have opportunity. You have a calling. And in your family, your community, your school, your workplace, you may be the one God is daring to step up, to speak out, to lead forward. The rescue didn't end. It continues through those who dare to say yes. And so today we begin with Deborah. Let me set the scene. The book of Judges is one of the darkest and most chaotic books in all of Scripture. It's a raw, unfiltered portrait of a nation that had forgotten its identity, a people that had lost their way. Judges comes after the conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua, when the Israelites were supposed to settle the land, drive out idolatry, and live in covenant faithfulness to God. But instead of faithfulness, we see failure. And that failure spirals again and again. Judges follows a reoccurring pattern, a cycle that plays like a broken record. Rebellion, oppression, supplication, rescue, repeat. The people rebel by worshiping false God. God allows them to fall under oppression of enemy nations. They cry out in desperation. God in mercy raises up a judge, a deliverer. Peace returns for a time, but then the cycle starts all over again. In fact, this cycle happens so often that a haunting refrain echoes through the book. It's this: in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And it's not just political commentary. It's a spiritual crisis. Israel isn't just a nation in turmoil. They are a people in covenant with God. They are the children of Abraham, the people through whom God promises to bless the world, the family through whom, according to Genesis 12 and Genesis 22, the Messiah, the rescuer, would one day be born. So every time this cycle of rebellion spins again, it's not just Israel's safety that's at risk. It's the lineage of the Redeemer. The hope of the world hangs in the balance with Israel's behavior. If Israel collapses, the covenant collapses. If the covenant collapses, the rescue halts. But God, rich in mercy, does not let go. He keeps raising up leaders to rescue his people, to preserve his promise, to carry the covenant forward. And in Judges 4, when all seems lost, he raises up someone no one expected. A prophet, a judge, a woman, Deborah. Judges 4 opens with a tragic and familiar refrain. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. God's people are under the boot of oppression once again. The commander of the enemy army is Sisera, a brutal and violent man who commands 900 iron chariots. That's like saying he had the most advanced military machinery of the day at his disposal. The Israelites are terrified, and no one is stepping up except one. Judges 4:4 tells us, now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. Just one verse, just one statement, but what a sentence that is. Deborah is introduced not only as a wife, but as a prophet and a judge. And this is remarkable in a time when men predominantly filled every leadership role, military, religious, civic. Here stands Deborah, already established as a national leader. She is the only woman in the entire book of Judges who holds the office of judge. She's the only judge in the book explicitly referred to as a prophet. And while the other judges, Gideon, Samson, Jephthah, are remembered for their dramatic military exploits, Deborah is remembered first for her wisdom and her spiritual insight. She sat under a palm tree in the hill country as the people of Israel came to her to settle disputes, to hear the word of the Lord, and to receive counsel. This palm tree wasn't just a shady spot, it became a seat of justice in a land of confusion. Deborah stands out because she stands up in a time when the nation was unraveling. There was no king, no centralized leadership. Moral relativism ran rampant, and yet there is a woman who doesn't just exist in the story. She guides it. In a world of male warriors, she was a woman of wisdom. In a culture that silenced women, she was a voice of God. In a time when fear was contagious, she embodied courage. Deborah didn't just defy expectations. She fulfilled God's intentions. Because when others hesitated, Deborah acted. When others stood still, Deborah stood up. She was a leader who listened to the Lord, and that made all the difference. And guess what? It still does today. So therein lies the first truth I want us to wrestle with today. Deborah was daring enough to lead, when no one else will. She doesn't wait for the perfect title. She doesn't wait for public approval. She doesn't wait for a man to come and take the reins. She obeys God. And that brings us to Barak. God gives Deborah a word, a command, a call to battle. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera into your hands." But what does Barak say? He says this: If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Church, Barak hesitates. He knows the command of God. He hears the promise of victory, and still he hesitates. Now, before we come down too hard on Barak, let me just ask you, have you ever known what God wanted you to do but hesitated? Have you ever let fear outshine your faith? Have you ever stood at the edge of obedience and said, "I'll go if someone else goes with me"? Barak is a mirror, church, a reflection of the reluctant heart in all of us. But Deborah, she says in verse 9, "Certainly I will go with you. But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Now that's not a jab, that's prophecy. Deborah leads, Deborah fights, Deborah dares, even though it was unheard of in her culture, even though it would have raised eyebrows and questions, even though she didn't have the armor or the title. She steps up because she trusts the one who called her. Let me say that again. She steps up because she trusts the one who called her. So Deborah, Barak, and the army of Israel go out to meet Sisera. And here's where things get real interesting in the story. Sisera chooses the battleground. Or so it seems. The text tells us his iron chariots assemble near the Kishon River, a region that is marked by dry riverbeds in the desert called wadis. These are seasonal channels. They're bone dry most of the year, but when rain comes, they flood rapidly and dangerously. But in dry weather like he had at that point, perfect terrain. They made perfect terrain for fast-moving iron chariots to gain momentum and cut through the slower foot soldiers that Israel had like a blade through wheat. From a military standpoint, Sisera held all the cards. He had the technology, he had the terrain, he had the tactical upper hand. But God, listen to this, but God had the weather. Judges 5 gives us the inside scoop, the divine play-by-play that Judges 4 leaves out. From the heavens, the stars fought, and the river Kishon swept them away. A storm came, rain poured, those dry desert wadis turned into torrents. Sisera's chariots, the pride of his military machine, bogged down, stuck, useless in the mud. What once gave him power now spelled his downfall. And Deborah, she had told Barak exactly what God would do. She trusted the promise of God before she saw the proof. And here's the truth, church. God doesn't need favorable terrain. He owns the battlefield. Amen? What looks like an advantage to the enemy can become the very tool of their defeat in the hands of God. But it takes courage, faith-fueled courage, to charge into a fight where the odds look stacked against you. Deborah led not because she had confidence in the terrain, but because she had confidence in the God who commands the storm. And here's where the second major truth of Deborah's story unfolds. Deborah's leadership was courageous, but God's rescue was miraculous. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't superior weapons. It was God. God routed Sisera. God delivered Israel. But God did it through the obedience of Deborah. She followed in faith. She led when no one else would, and she gave God all the glory. That, my friends, is what daring leadership looks like. So let me talk to the leaders in this room this morning. And I don't just mean the shepherds or the ministry leaders. I mean mothers and fathers. I mean teachers and coaches. I mean every believer. I mean students. I mean every believer who hears God's voice and feels the call to step forward. Leadership is not about having a title, folks. It's not about always having the right answer. Leadership is about obedience. Leadership is about courage. Leadership is about stepping into the battle even when you're shaking in your boots. And sometimes, let's be real here, sometimes God calls you to stand under your own palm tree and speak truth into a world that does not want to hear it. Sometimes God asks you to walk with someone who's hesitating. Sometimes He asks you to just go first. And when He does, will you dare to lead? Now look, if you know the story of Deborah, I know what you may be thinking at this point in the story. You're thinking, wait a second, preacher. Wasn't it the woman Jael, not Deborah, who actually killed Sisera? And yes, you would be right. And if you need a good Old Testament bedtime story to keep your kids up at night, Judges 4:21 is your jam. Let me read it for you. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he was fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the tent peg through his temple into the ground and he died. Sweet dreams, little ones, right? Jael wasn't an Israelite. She was a Kenite woman, part of a nomadic people who had friendly ties with both Israel and King Jabin, Sisera's boss. So when Sisera fled the battlefield and stumbled into Jael's tent for refuge, he probably thought he had found a safe haven. Jael gave him milk. She covered him with a blanket. She promised to keep watch at the door, and then tent peg through the temple into the ground. I don't know about you, but I have some friends who are real serious about camping, but that is next level. And here's the kicker. Deborah had already prophesied this. Remember what she said to Barak in Judges 4:9? The honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Most probably assumed she meant herself. But in God's irony and God's sovereignty, it was Jael, a woman with no army, no title, and no battlefield who brought the final blow. It's brutal. It's unexpected. And it's another reminder that God's rescue doesn't always follow conventional strategies. Sometimes it shows up in the hands of a courageous woman and a camping tool. But here's the point. God rescued his people. He used Deborah's faith. He used Barak's eventual obedience. He used Jael's courage. He used creation itself. And the people of God were delivered, not because of perfect leadership, but because of faith-filled leadership. Deborah didn't trust in herself. She trusted in God. Church, that's the kind of leadership we need today. Leadership that listens to the Lord. Leadership that leads when others hesitate. Leadership that knows that victory belongs to God. Because the same God who brought rain down on Sisera's army is still fighting battles for us today. You may not feel ready. You may not feel qualified. You may not feel strong enough. But Deborah probably didn't either. And yet she led. She listened. She obeyed. She went. Because when the people of God were paralyzed by fear, she stood up in faith. When the enemy lined the battlefield with iron chariots, she lined her heart with the promises of God. When Barak hesitated, Deborah advanced, and now it's your turn. Church, hear me clearly. God is still looking for Deborahs. Not just women, not just what we consider to be leaders, but people, faithful people, daring people who are willing to move when God says move, who are willing to step forward when everyone else steps back. We don't get to sit on the sidelines of redemption. We don't get to stand by as spectators while the mission of God continues all around us. No, we are part of it. And in your life, your family, your job, your relationships, your decisions, God has placed you right where you are for such a time as this. So rise. Rise in faith. Rise in obedience. Rise in courage. Stop waiting for better conditions. Stop waiting for someone else to do it. Stop waiting to feel ready. Because God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. And when he says go, he sends rain. He reroutes armies. He rolls stones. He splits seas. He collapses strongholds. But he is waiting on you to step forward. The battle belongs to the Lord. But the leadership begins with you. So, church, will you dare to lead? Will you dare to trust? Will you dare to follow? The God of Deborah is still writing his story, and he's calling you. Again, I ask, will you dare to follow? Here are your 3 questions. Through your answers to these questions, you propel God's rescue forward. There are souls out there who need to see Jesus Christ. Show them, invite them into the fullness of life. Bring rescue. Be blessed. Be a blessing to others.